Welcome everyone to our guilt-free book club. Josh and Megan here, joining you from Wentworth's Success Studio conference room.
Hello, hello. Good to be here.
Exciting to be here on campus. We're here to discuss this book, Relationship-Rich Education: How Human Connections Drive Success in College by Peter Felten and Leo M. Lambert. So what I'd love to do to start us off is just to go around and share your name, where you work, and what you do within the colleges of the Fenway. And tell us about a relationship that you had with a faculty member when you were a student in a higher education setting, a relationship that was meaningful to you and influential to you, just to kind of start by personalizing this theme of relationship-rich education. So I'll begin and welcome Lauren. Thank you so much for joining us. And so my name is Josh Luckens, and I work here at Wentworth in the Teaching and Learning Collaborative as an instructional designer. And a relationship that I'm thinking about is actually a professor I had in graduate school who was just really kind of warm and friendly and encouraged us to make meetings with him, come to his office hours, and just kind of talk about whatever we wanted to talk about. And I did over my couple of years at Emerson, and it was incredible, just the relationship we were able to build and all the things that I learned from that and got from that, and the way he was able to reflect back things that he saw in me that maybe were very nascent in myself that I didn't even recognize yet. And also how some of those conversations inspired me to think more broadly about what my possible paths might be after that program. A lot of people were, it was like a pre-service, secondary educator program. So a lot of people just went into being a high school teacher. And I ended up getting a Fulbright fellowship and living in Columbia for a year and doing all sorts of other things. And, many years later, I found myself here, and I'm very happy to be here. And some people who I went to that program with, have been in, teaching in a public school for a decade. And so it's, I kind of, thank that professor and that relationship for opening up the field of possibility beyond just kind of the narrow reason that I maybe initially went to that program. So that was just a relationship that kind of changed my course and my life, just based on the discussions we had and the openness to having those conversations. So yeah. You want to take the next one, Megan, and then we'll go to our Zoom participants?
Sure, while our mic is still open here. My name is Megan Hamilton Giebert. I'm the Associate Director of Learning Design Solutions in Teaching and Learning Collaborative at Wentworth. So I work directly with Josh and with Sarah, who's also on the call. I am very excited to be here. And in thinking about the question of meaningful relationships, there's a lot to choose from in grad school in particular, where it is very much more mentoring focused and almost the relationships and the networks that you're building in grad school, almost more important than the assessments that are going on in the courses you're taking. But I'm actually thinking of an experience back in my undergrad of a professor who actually granted me an extended due date on an assignment because I was feeling really broken and overwhelmed by it. And I remember going into her office feeling like I was such a failure that I could not deliver this in time, but just with 24 hours, I would have been able to deliver it. And she looked at me like it was nothing, like, yeah, don't agonize over it. Take the hours you need to turn in your best work. And I think that was the start of that valuing the relationship more than the score in the classroom for me, kind of, started emerging in that undergrad experience.
Nice. Thanks, Megan. Yeah. Let's move on to our friends on Zoom. Feel free to unmute and introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Marie Claire. I'm the operations coordinator at the Academic Resource Center at MassArt. And I never developed any relationship with a faculty member in college.
Hi, I'm Tom Bacho. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Support in the Success Studio. I manage the tutoring program here. And one that kind of first one came on, it wasn't actually a professor I had for a class, but it was my undergraduate like a research supervisor, I guess, and so that was just a helpful relationship in like just learning some of the professional norms. Like, I don't know, don't just like swing by and assume your very busy professor is like available at any time, like set up a meeting, like simple things like that. And also just how to make a presentation, how to tell a story in a poster, like some of these things that like you don't necessarily aren't explicitly like taught in the class, but you kind of gather through some of that mentorship. And so that was very helpful to me in just learning some of those kind of broader skills and some of these ways of like applying and communicating what you were learning in class in like a broader setting.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lauren Melfi. I teach applied math at Wentworth, and I feel like I'm coming to this with a couple of half-baked answers, but certainly one of my summer research supervisors at a totally different institution. I was doing a research experience for undergraduates in RU that the NSF funds, and the faculty member that I was working with on that just had a really good energy about how he wanted to run his group. He was crossing disciplinary boundaries and had a couple of us working with him in various aspects of the project, and just the whole vibe of that project and such. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of research, but it was a very friendly, positive experience at the time.
Nice, thanks.
I'm Sarah. I work in the Teaching and Learning Collaborative with Megan and Josh. I'm also an instructional designer, and I'm trying to think of a specific experience, but one that definitely stands out is there was a time I wanted to take a course that we didn't have, and I was starting to look for options in our consortium, and my advisor was like, hey, we could just do an independent study and I'll run it for you. And that was one of the first times that I really got to take charge of my own learning and really focus on something I was very specifically interested in, and that was really cool.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. So I just tossed in the chat a link to a collaborative notes document. It's an opportunity for us both to share anything that we've been thinking of, not only prior while doing the reading, but also just in our conversation. If you have any notes, anything, takeaways, and also there's a few quotes that we threw in there of kind of key quotes from the chapter. So feel free to have a look at that document. I can even share it so that the folks who may be viewing this recording later have the opportunity to take a look as well. So we have Guilford Book Club Collaborative Notes, Relationship Rich Education, and some quotes for us to start with. And then you feel free to add more quotes if you have any favorite quotes from the chapter, key takeaways, and any action steps or other resources that you have related to what we are talking about today. So let's just start with kind of one of the very beginning of the chapter. The authors say that the classroom is the primary point of contact between institutions and undergraduates. So it is the single most important site for students to experience welcome and care, to be inspired to learn, to build webs of relationships, and to ask questions of meaning and purpose. So yeah, that's kind of their thesis in talking about chapter 4, which is about creating relationship-rich classrooms and the importance of that. So how have you all seen that happen, both as students, as faculty members, or as people who work in universities? How have you seen the classroom be a really important site for students to experience that feeling of belonging and build those webs of relationships with faculty, with other students, that will help set them up for successful, meaningful learning, and eventually, hopefully, retention and graduation? Anything in the chapter that you looked at that stood out to you from some things that the authors describe, techniques, or things that the authors describe other faculty members from other universities doing that were like, oh yeah, that is pretty cool how other folks frame this notion of how they see their role in the classroom as educators?
So guilt-free, I like read 2 pages and then skimmed the rest. So I'm going to come back to something
Yeah.
I've done, which is I started at Wentworth during the pandemic and or during the most heightened response to the pandemic, and the structure of Zoom classes doesn't really lend itself very well to a feeling of immediate belonging and community. But one of the things that I did in class that first semester was we took a break in the middle of class and played some music. And one of my classes loved it. They responded a ton, and just like, they were commenting on whether or not they liked the song and how they were adding more songs to their playlist because of me. And like the little things like that you can do even when the rest of the whole atmosphere is maybe not working so well in that regard. The little touches, they can be hit or miss, but they can hit.
Thanks for sharing that, Lauren. To jump off that into just a theme of the chapter that I did read, although it was a while ago, so I'm a bit rusty and forgot most of it. But it had some really just practical examples of things that faculty could do that are relatively easy lifts. For example, calling a student by name instead of just saying, hey, you, and pointing. Like the power of recognizing somebody's name and the effect that has on a student's well-being is so profound for such a simple thing. And if you are bad with names and have trouble remembering them, and they change every semester, just the idea of the little name tents, I thought was brilliant. That way everyone can write their name, write their pronouns, you can get the spelling, you can ask them to correct how to pronounce it. But just that small moment of name recognition, that's a easy intervention that becomes a very light lift for an instructor that can have a big impact on how a student feels like they belong. So there's no active relationship building, I think. Good say.
One thing I found interesting was how a relationship that worked both in person and virtual, and that was the relationship students had with writing tutors. And if it was in person, they made a connection because the person was helping them with a class. But if it was virtual, they made a connection because if they had a Zoom class and a virtual writing tutor, they developed a one-on-one relationship with the tutor, which was interesting. And also how one instructor noted that in the beginning of the semester, he would tell students that at the end of the semester, they would start to agonize over all the things that piled up, and they didn't have to, they could just talk to him. And I thought that was an important way to start the semester because that does happen.
Yeah, it's easy to forget how overwhelming it can be as a student, I think, when you've got a full course load and you're struggling to master concepts that are in many cases completely unfamiliar to you, like remembering that your students are beginners in topics and remembering that they need patience and moments of grace built in to help them pursue so that they can succeed in your course. So having that moment of grace, that flexibility, that opportunity for a one-on-one to share concerns, I think is that can be a difference maker for so many students.
Yeah, and it certainly is easier to connect one-on-one, whether it's Zoom or in person, and build a relationship. I think the more challenging thing, as Lauren was alluding to, is when you have a big group of people in front of you, whether it's on Zoom or in a room, how to make that relationship feel personal and connected and not just transactional. And it clearly takes effort, it takes intention, it takes techniques of not just like, it's not just going to happen naturally, particularly over Zoom. And so some of those things that you try, as Lauren said, let's try a thing where we try and connect over music. That's going to work really well for some students and for some sections or groups, and maybe not as well for others. But if you try 6 different things, guarantee you'll reach a student, well, at least one of your students with one of them. So just the more that we put effort and energy into that, the more it's going to happen, and the more dividends it'll pay later on in the class when people are, struggling in need of help. Then they have people to reach out to, whether it's the faculty member or their peers. Lauren, what were you going to say?
Well, so I think it's interesting that, if I'm remembering correctly a little bit, that I did get to, that we can talk about the connection between the faculty-student relationships that we build, and the student-to-student relationships that they build amongst themselves in our classroom. And so, and that it seems like in both of these cases, there are interventions or things that we can do that are easy lifts for us or harder lifts for us. And there are things that we can try to do that require some level of the student buy-in. I've had semesters, I'm teaching differential equations, and in a previous semester with a classroom full of whiteboards, I encouraged groups to get up and work on a whiteboard together on an example problem, but they had the choice to work on their paper or solo in some fashion if they wanted to. And, I didn't want to force that on anybody at that time, but I had groups that took me up on it, and I had groups I had individuals who stayed seated, and I think the dynamic between those subsets of students was different. And I have another iteration of that class right now. Obviously, the summer group is going to be different, have a little bit of a change of interest, change of motivation. But I can tell already that they're just going to want to turn in and do their own thing. And so I think I'm going to struggle some with helping them build the student-student relationships because they haven't decided to buy in on that in the same way.
That's definitely tricky. And I think I'm seeing 2 larger points there. One, in that it's not all on the faculty or all on the classroom, facilitator to create the relationships. There needs to be buy-in. There needs to be some sort of mutual, expectation setting from the students as well. And that does require some surrendering of control on your part as the leader of that group to make space for. And then the other thing I'm noticing is that occasionally our principles of good teaching and what we know about learning butt up against each other. Like, we know it's great to give students choice. So, okay, you have the option to work by yourself, or you have the option to work with a group. We also know that when you work as a group, there's a lot of learning value and potential with that. So what do? Do I give students a choice, or do I listen to Vygotsky and all of his learning theory? And like, it's learning about groups anyway. So it's not easy. But yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned the pandemic. I think coming back from that time of such isolation, I've noticed in my conversations with faculty and students a bit more awkwardness and reticence to just dive in and jump in. So there, I think, needs to be in this time particularly a bit more of a invitation and a structured invitation from instructors to get folks working together, mixing up the groups, mingling, talking, actually collaborating, because it's just not going to happen as organically as it might if you had a group of students who was a bit more kind of vivacious or socially oriented. But as Megan said, we know there are the benefits to this type of collaboration. And I think that something that the authors stress in this chapter is the faculty who do this successfully really make it clear and explicit from day one with students what they're doing and why they're doing it and what the benefits are, grounding their framing of the course in research. And that's throughout the chapter. We can talk about that more, all the different research studies that they cite of how relationship rich and how classrooms and how collaborative spaces are more effective for learning. But I really love how some of these faculty members frame their courses. And I just want to introduce some of that language and that framing. So Mays Imad, who is a favorite from last year's book club about trauma-informed pedagogy, talks about her classroom as a learning sanctuary. And I love that framing of a learning sanctuary. And she's teaching STEM, so it's not, she's not just talking about ideas. She's, doing hard science, but she calls that she says she's transformed her classroom through what she calls relational teaching. And that, there was this whole other initiative they talk about later called Being Human in STEM. But it sounds like Mays Imad is really trying to put the personal, the human, the connection, the relatedness back into that STEM education. And another STEM educator, Brian Dewsbury, who's a biology professor, talks about creating a community of scholars. And even though, on day one, they really should be doing mitosis or whatever, he has students in huge classes, first year biology classes, write this I believe statements about their statement of purpose for studying biology, and talk to each other and build relationships. And he's really explicit about the point of this. It's not just, some touchy-feely thing. The point is to get you connected to your why and to get you connected to people in this massive class, because he can't support, 50 people coming to office hours. But if you have a question about mitosis and you have now connections with 4 of your classmates who you've worked with, you can support each other. And that's just going to be a lot more of an effective strategy. So by being really explicit about, the culture you're creating in the classroom, why and how that's going to benefit students if they buy into it, it can be a little bit more, I guess, effective than just kind of throwing a couple things out there and, seeing if students grab at them. Yeah, what else? What other thoughts do you guys have from the chapter, from this notion of like how you create a culture in your classroom, a culture of that relationships, connections, understanding the why and the purpose of what you're doing in your courses?
One thing that's been interesting for me to think about is I really it seems like we're getting to a movement in general of higher ed of talking more about how higher ed works and that process. Like, oh, we know that weed out culture doesn't work, but now we're actually talking about that. But it's also awkward. I feel like we're in this transition mode, even for me, where it's like, oh, we never used to talk about that. Like, it's okay to talk about that now, but that still feels weird for me because I'm so ingrained to that from my own education. So I feel like it's, the more we try, the better we're going to get. But I feel like it is going to be a little bit awkward, and like, how can we have more human STEM? But like, the culture's not adjusted yet, but we need to do that to move the culture, if that makes sense. So it's an interesting kind of time to be in higher ed and watching that process play out.
For sure.
I have some thoughts in response to that, but I saw Tom on mute. I want you to have a turn, Tom. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I thought some of what, I don't know, like I had a few thoughts about this, but I mean, I think it's very interesting. And I mean, one of the things that's just hard is like it's nice that they outline some like light touch things, but they also describe one that seemed pretty effective, but also just like very time intensive. Like I thought there were like 4-step thing from that. I think it was like a community college that they kind of went into detail about, where like, I think 2 of them were pretty like light touch. It's like learn the students' names and like set clear expectations, and also that like it's okay if like you struggle in the beginning. But then the other 2 are like give kind of like constructive feedback early on an assessment, which like depending on your class size is kind of like a big ask on the professor, and then as well like having 15-minute meeting with a one-on-one with every student kind of early on, which is like by far the most intense, but also it kind of sounded the way they were describing it like the most effective. And so I thought that was interesting from like considering the faculty to student relationship in terms of like, I don't know, that it seems like some of the time intensive stuff might be, it strikes me as maybe the most effective, but also like the least practical. And then in terms of the student to student thing, I thought it was interesting where they noted like how you structure that is critical. Like, you know, they mentioned like some of the research and things like, it's not like students are lazy or unmotivated necessarily, but like some are going to feel more comfortable in others in groups. Some are going to, you know, have anxiety about working in groups, or maybe some students dominate the conversation over others. So like how you structure that really matters. So yeah, I mean, I think my general perception is just like, you know, the fact that time is so finite in a classroom is such a limiting factor. And like my general perception is like often people start with really like students and faculty start with like the best intentions at the beginning of the semester. And by the end of the semester, like it's just so hard to avoid the path of least resistance and trying to fit everything in that you wind up with more time just the professor talking and, you know, on the student end, like lower participation, lower attendance, like everyone kind of settles into like, it's just hard to avoid the path of least resistance of kind of the professor talking more and the students talking less, because it's kind of easier for both parties. So I think this outlines some ways that, you know, can kind of help avoid that, but it feels like that's the like big like gravitational pull that you're always trying to avoid.
We're up against a lot, like, so tied to that, you know, you're right, some of the things in the book are really pretty achievable lists. Some of them are not and require, you know, a systemic new way of thinking about what we use classrooms for. And we're going against a pretty strong tide, I think, in terms of the, you know, the sage on the stage of, you know, I'm a professor and I'm dispensing information. That's not just, you know, there's a history and a legacy to that we are trying to undo. And like Sarah said, she's noticed some of the tension and transition of that reckoning. All this to say, yeah, it's good to be skeptical too as you're reading, and like if you read an idea like, oh, that's nice, you have time for 15-minute conversations with each of your students. No thanks, that's unachievable right now. But on the other hand, I found myself wondering, how did we get so far away from a 15-minute conversation being impossible? You know, like how did we stuff our classrooms full of, oh, I got to cover this content item. Oh, I got to, you know, make sure they understand these 3 objectives and they need to make sure they're ready to sit for this exam. You know, that we kind of like engineered relationships out of our classrooms in a lot of ways. And so as squishy and as, you know, fluffy as the idea of relationship building in the classroom seems to be sometimes, I also find myself thinking like, why do we need a book telling us how to build relationships in our classrooms? How did we get here? So I don't know. That was a lot of half-baked thoughts and some rage, but you know, I'll go on mute.
Yeah, I think the authors would say that we don't need a book to tell us how to build relationships with students. But I think a lot of the structural critiques that we're bringing up are, you know, go back to the ways that teaching and learning has transformed since the beginnings of humans teaching and learning, which was very much, you know, one-on-one, I'm going to teach you how to make a fire. One-on-one, I'm going to teach you how to be a blacksmith, you know, or in a small group. And then we have you know, the Industrial Revolution, and the industrial model gets in the assembly line, and we need, you know, credentialing, and we need grading, and we need big groups, and we need all these things. And then it becomes about monetizing the credentials, all this stuff. And then, of course, now one of the things they critique in the chapter is adjuncts, if you have half your courses being taught by adjuncts, they definitely don't have time for 10-minute
Yeah.
conversations with all their students because they're teaching at 6 other places and have 4 other part-time jobs just to pay the rent. So there are a lot of structural challenges in the way. But I see Lauren's unmuted. What are you going to say?
Well, I was actually going to go in about the same direction you did. You went further back in history than I was going to, but I was going to bring up, Socratic method and those kinds of conversations.
Bring it up.
So, no, that was where I was going. Is like I think some of what we're seeing now is, of course, the impact of more societal capitalism and business models, and the fact that you have to have the fact that we're supporting more students for our time, but there's also the notion, if you think about the progression of how much was being learned then versus now, some of it's also this buildup of here's how much prior knowledge I need to be able to progress in my degree or program and career of choice. That we now, so being in a very prerequisite and hierarchical knowledge domain myself, right? It's, well, I have to get this far in Calc 1 so that the folks in Calc 2 are prepared. And we're squishing, presumably we're squishing more and more course material into the time frame that we have. We don't want to extend the time frame because money and capitalism and logistics, and getting people out to be to do the next thing as part of society. But at the same time, we've learned so much over the years that there's a perception of how much you need to know in order to go on to that next thing and be part of that next thing. And so the dueling of here's how much we need to build into this, as well as here's how quickly you need to do it. The how quickly doesn't do anybody any favors, I don't think. But it's where we are as a bigger structural thing.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder too, I'm kind of curious. I don't know if Marie has observation. It seems like the experiences in different disciplines or majors can be very different. Where like in the engineering students, there's, I don't know, it seems like the way that curriculum design is just a lot less opportunities to have that kind of thing. Whereas I know at least in art, at Wentworth, maybe the furthest thing we have in that is our architecture program, where there's a lot of, you get critical feedback. You do a project, you get critical feedback from a professor, you iterate, and I understand that stuff less well, but the students and tutors talk to me about it. But it seems like there's more opportunities, and at the way some disciplines have just traditionally operated, to have some of those relationships. I wonder if it translates to the experience. So I don't know how maybe the experience of an art student or an architecture student might be different from an engineering student, or if there's still this kind of feeling of I need to cram all this stuff in, and I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to undermine the importance of those topics either, because you do need to understand these before you can move on to the next. And in fields like engineering, yeah, you need to make sure the bridge won't fall down when you design it. That's kind of important, and so you can't afford to not educate your students on those principles. But there has to be room for both, or there has to be a room for a integrated way forward with the content, but also the people who are connected and invested in it. I think our current structure is trying to grow to be able to fit that, but change is very slow.
There's certainly some ongoing conversation in the pockets of the math community about the notion that, you know, if we are packing all of this content in, that doesn't necessarily mean that students are learning it as effectively, and the relationship building aspects and the more inquiry oriented aspects that are perceived as taking more time are still more beneficial if we can approach it in a way that works for the overall needs.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like too, I don't know, with like the like push, like, okay, you need this much, you need to have seen this to like do this next thing in the next class. So like there's a strong professor, you know, you need to have said like you did these things, and even if it's like kind of nominal, I don't know, like it's so I feel like especially in certain curriculum, like if the discussion and relationship isn't seen as like the product in itself, if it's seen as a means, it's an easy means to like kind of plow through, because you say like, all right, well, I've got 2 weeks left and I need to cover these 3 topics. So like, you know, if I lecture 40 minutes on each of those topics, then like I've met that learning objective. But if the learning objective is like, you know, did the student receive at some point like critical feedback about like, I don't know, this thing, did they work in a group project? Like, I don't know, it becomes a different thing where I think like, I don't know, in my college experience, at least, I feel like most of my like, a lot of it happened outside of the STEM courses. A lot of it was in like the electives where like having a discussion kind of was a learning objective, and like being able to have maybe like a debate or a, you know, critical discussion was seen as maybe a learning objective, whereas it wasn't just like, all right, like we've covered, I don't know, these 15 topics in the course of the course. So I don't know.
Yeah, so just to be really clear, learning objectives are always student-centered. So students will be able to do X, Y, or Z thing. So learning objectives cannot by nature have anything to do with what the professor is going, like the professor is going to cover this, like who cares? That is nothing, that is absolutely irrelevant to what the students are going to be able to do. I could go to a class tomorrow and the professor could spend 2 hours lecturing on integral whatever, and it would mean nothing to me. And so there was no, you know, it's irrelevant. So the whole point is to have, you know, this thing that, you know, we are designing experiences that are going to work for the students, that the students are going to be able to do something, get something out of it, take it to the next level as a result of the experience we create. Sometimes that does involve telling them about things, and that's great, but sometimes it involves more active methods of learning. And I think that the authors aren't suggesting anything radical or new. They're looking at research into like what makes teaching and learning effective. And they're like, oh, wow, okay. At this huge class where there's 150 students, there was a section where they had no name tents and the professor didn't know anyone's name, because how are you going to know 150 people's names in the second day class? There's no way, right? And then there's another section where they all had name tents. And the name tent section, like, had statistically significant better learning outcomes. Like they learned more just because the professor could call them by their name, and the students were able to say, oh yeah, I felt like more seen, more belonging, more included, whatever. And it's like, oh wow, that's a tiny intervention that, you know, they've done research on and proven to see that that's working. And Tom, you were alluding to earlier this persistence project, which is a research informed practices that were implemented at Oakton Community College. And the first one, again, has to do with names. It's interesting because whether you learn the students' names or you just call them by their name because they have a name tag or a name tent, actually didn't seem to matter that much. The fact that people got called by their names made them feel like present, and, you know, hey.
It's my favorite word in the English language is Megan. Like, who knew?
The second thing was just to give a student some sort of success-oriented feedback. So the something that was a real big thread in this chapter was self-efficacy, which is a concept that comes from an educational theorist and psychologist called Albert Bandura. And the idea of self-efficacy is when we believe that we are capable of doing something, we'll be more capable at doing it. And when we believe that we are not so capable of doing something, we're not going to be so capable of doing it. And that seems kind of intuitive and it seems kind of touchy-feely, but it's just proven by decades of research into human behavior and human psychology. So if we can leverage that, be like, okay, early on in the term, I'm going to give you something to do where you can feel a sense of self-efficacy that you are capable in this discipline, in this class, in this thing, you're going to have more persistence when things get harder. And if I can give students some sort of feedback, some sort of like, here's all the awesome things, what you're doing really well, and here's a way to improve, then they can take that and run with it, especially, and this isn't in the chapter, but this is connected to other research that I've read, especially when it's not connected to a grade. If you have the letter B on it, then whatever you write about whatever they did in steps in the math problem, whatever their design for the architecture, their paper they wrote for history, that is not going to be taken in as much. So that's just a technique. So that's the second step that Oakton Community College does in their persistence project. The third is just, again, about creating that culture. So articulating high standards, high expectations, but not in a way that's like, if you don't make it, you're out, or, this is strict and stern, but instead, I believe in you, and here's the standard. And if you don't meet it, it's okay, because there's an opportunity to do better. There's an opportunity to course correct. And I'm going to provide that structurally in my course. And as Megan said, what that structure is could look totally different depending on the course. Maybe you have a huge group of students, maybe you have a small group of students, maybe you do a lot of quizzes, maybe you do no quizzes and you do all projects. Like, it could totally look different, but as long as students know it's okay and part of the learning process to experience some sort of failure, not doing it as well the first time, and that you can come back, get feedback, improve, and that's actually how you learn, and that we value that, they're going to have that persistence, right? Remember, it's called the Persistence Project. And then Tom was alluding to the fourth one, meet one-on-one with each student for 10 to 15 minutes. One of the professors who participated, it says, when I added the one-on-one conferences, it transformed both me and my teaching. So that, as you said, a bit more time intensive, but very, very meaningful and impactful. And for a studio course, you could probably do that. You have, 15 students, like, 10 minutes, put it on my Calendly, whatever, do it on Zoom. If you have 150 students, probably not going to happen. But again, there are ways to build in some sort of relationship building. If you can't do it with student professor, maybe like Brian Dewsbury, you do it in study groups that you structure and organize and build on in the course. So there's a lot of ways to do it, and no one's suggesting that there's any one size fits all approach that's going to fit every discipline or every course. But it does seem clear from the research that they're citing throughout this chapter that having your course not just be focused on here's the content, blah, 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 but here's a space that we're all going to be in, of inquiry, of belonging, as some of these other professors have already alluded to, community of scholars, community of inquiry, that you're just going to have better student outcomes. The students are going to learn more deeply, and be more engaged, and persist throughout their course of study at the institution. So I guess that's kind of my takeaway, is that it's not about like, doing anything too touchy-feely or radically transforming everything. It's just like, what can you do in your classroom to add, one little bit more of richer web of relationships based on some of these techniques that we've read about. Those are some of my thoughts.
Good thoughts. I'm just writing on them right now.
I'll bring in one more quote from page 91. They say the horizontal peer-to-peer relationships are the ones that keep students, especially students who are marginalized, from letting each other fail. So another thread that I noticed in this chapter is that a lot of the research studies indicate that there's a statistically significant impact for these relationship-rich practices for students from traditionally marginalized backgrounds, whether they're first gen or students of color or whatever it might be. They actually see increased better outcomes, better retention, better grades, etc., when there are these types of practices in place. So it seems kind of like a no-brainer to do it, but also it's just interesting that that would be the case. So any reflections on that, about why you think that might be the case, or just like how we could bring more of those practices in to support those students succeeding in our classrooms?
I mean, I can't speak for the lived experiences of first gen or underrepresented students, but I can speak from the place of privilege in that both of my parents went to college, and I was very familiar with higher education, and I knew that my option after high school was to go to college. And I had a supportive, norm within my family that was established. And I also had parents who supported me in my college search and kind of helped me know what to expect when getting there. And those are advantages to navigating a college campus that not everyone has. So trying to imagine the experiences, you get there and you know no one, and then there is no one in your support network you can ask for advice or guidance or just a point in the right direction. Of course, the power of, a friendly instructor coming in, helping you feel welcome, learning your name, learning how to pronounce it properly. Of course, that's going to improve my conditions and my likelihood of pursuing through college.
I read something this morning in the relating back to the persistence project and what we're saying about different groups of students about the kind of feedback that we give. And so one of the phrases or notions that goes around, I think, is the idea of the feedback sandwich, where you say something positive and then put your constructive feedback in the middle and then end with positive stuff again, versus just, here's the feedback. But apparently, and I didn't track down this blog's sources, but apparently there was a study that that the feedback sandwich and a strategy that they were calling wise feedback, which is that more of a flavor of here's the feedback, but I'm giving you this feedback because I know you can do this, right? That kind of added flavor. That those two had similar impact on whether a student was going to go back and revise their work and improve their work accordingly. But that the wise feedback of conveying that notion that they can hit those higher expectations, and that's why the feedback is being given, led to better results for under supported groups, underrepresented groups, in terms of their longer term persistence in the field. But it had less of it didn't really matter so much when they were looking at white students. The kind of feedback that they got didn't matter as much for their long-term persistence.
Brian Dewsbury writes in the chapter that students have come out of a system in their high schools often where knowing meant repeating something that an authority told them. And that's something that's actually particularly more present in schools that serve like more low-income populations in this country. Private schools and more like, fancy public schools basically have a lot more critical thinking and built into their curricula. And that's just something that's really devastating about our national system of education, which is totally inequitable. But essentially, this ties back into our first book club of Sandra McGuire, who talked about teaching students how to learn. So Brian Dewsbury says in his classes, he has to start off by teaching students how to learn, what even is learning in this new context of this class, of this institution. And that it actually sets his students up more for success than whatever other little feedback you could give them on their quizzes. And something that is noted from research and in terms of the balance you have to strike is that the learning has to be supported by two principles: positive interdependence, meaning that whatever you're asking students to do in a group requires enough collective effort that everyone has to participate in some meaningful way, and also individual accountability, meaning that each student is going to be also held accountable for what they do and how they bring into it, what they bring into it. And so it's kind of that combination, that balance of like, you know, getting across this message that the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it, and that the way you were studying in high school probably won't work in this new context. So here's some new tools and strategies to enable you to be successful in this new environment. And Sarah put in a great quote in the chat, in the document, in the collaborative notes document, about essentially every semester is a new start. It's a new beginning. So you get to create a new culture, meet new people, and kind of have that started from the get-go. So I thought that was really cool, in that it's not, you know, nothing, it's never like all lost. It's like we constantly in these cycles have places for new beginning, trying new techniques, ways to bring in those new strategies. Sarah, did you want to add anything about that? I know you threw that quote in our document. What did it mean to you?
Yeah, I really related to that, because as a student, I always appreciated kind of having that fresh start, not only going to college, but every semester it's like, yeah, okay, I'm kind of starting over, learning something new, but it also gives us a chance to kind of start with our students too, with relationships and how we're always kind of getting better and improving.
I was also thinking that the peer-to-peer relationship to help prevent failure might be because in a large classroom setting, you're more likely to not want to disappoint your peers, as opposed to whatever relationship or lack of a relationship you have with the instructor.
Absolutely, and that definitely is very developmentally appropriate for especially young undergraduates to be more influenced by what their peers are doing than by what one adult is suggesting.
I almost think of that in terms of siblings, not peers. Like, you don't have siblings, but I do. But you know, I have two siblings, and it's almost like you can, you know, collaborate and strategize about how to approach your parents. And I know that, you know, this is a personal relationship versus a professional, but I see a parallel there of like, okay, professor said we need to do this. Here's the objective. Here's how we'll strategize. Here's how we'll compare notes. I'll handle this part. You handle that part. So there's a lot of, you know, just support and strategy that they can build as a united front to approach the instructor, I think.
And particularly in a culture of grading, there often is this inherent feeling of like, the professor is on the other team, you know, is our enemy in this, you know, and so much of this chapter was about, and explicitly professor saying like, you know, I have to actively break that down. That's a dynamic that exists in the culture, in the structure of the system. I have to work hard to break that down. And by the end of the semester, students actually believe that I am on their team. I'm an ally in the process of learning. I want them to succeed. I want them to do well. And that's something that, you know, that students, we can't take for granted, that they come in with that belief. As we wrap up, any last thoughts from you all?
I mean, I just want to say I thought this was really cool reading, and it definitely gave me a lot to think about, and it, you know, it kind of like, it helped like contextualize and affirm some things I've noticed anecdotally, where like it does seem like, you know, I don't know, like when I'm teaching like the students, I have an opportunity to have that like personal conversation with it, like, I don't know, like they will often note that it enhanced their experience in the class. So it's you know, even just something like the simple thing of like learning students' names, like that was really helpful to know like how big of an impact that has. So yeah, I really liked, I think it gave a lot to think about in terms of like how to try to, you know, kind of systematize some of these things in a way that all really like impact all the students you're working with.
Marie-Claire, did you want to jump in?
Oh, yeah, I thought it was interesting that in both this article, the metaphor used with the trees and the roots was also used in the New York Times article on building relationships, but it wasn't, the theme wasn't academics. But I think it was someone in the group mentioned the sibling relationships with siblings.
Yeah.
And the writer was speaking about relationship, any type of relationship building, and they both used the same metaphor. And and the writer mentioned it began with obligation, whatever the group is, whatever it is, if it's a religious or a civic engagement or education, that in order for it to succeed, that it begins with obligation.
Nice.
Interesting parallels.
Lauren or Sarah, do you want to share anything? No worries if you don't.
Nothing new. I think the thing that I will keep coming back to is finding that balance of figuring out where I'm going to meet them and where they will meet me. That autonomy and buy-in versus strategies we know are useful. And the notion that some of the classroom strategies feel like they rely on a certain amount of buy-in that I know I won't always get. And so that's I think the dilemma that I will continue to come back to.
Absolutely.
It can be hard to tackle that after the semester started and after the habits have kind of fallen into place. So, that is Sarah's quote, that she shared about new semester, new start every time. It's a new experiment, basically.
Definitely, with a new group of students and new opportunity. So it's exciting. We get that refresher every time. So I'll just wrap up with a very quick quote from the chapter. The authors quote Bell Hooks, who writes, "Learning and talking together, we break the notion that our experience of gaining knowledge is private, individualistic, and competitive. By choosing and fostering dialogue, we engage mutually in a learning partnership." So hopefully that is what we're doing here as well. And I really appreciate all of you being here. Thanks so much for your contributions and for just showing up. Really, it's wonderful to have these discussions. Hopefully you'll join us again in about a month's time. We're going to read chapter 6 of this book about mentoring students. So please join us again on Zoom. You can find all the info on our website, the Feel Free Book Club page. Thanks for being here. Have a great rest of your afternoons.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, thank you.
Bye.